Hello and welcome to the lecture on dietary recommendations. This is going to be a really brief overview of what we refer to as dietary guidelines for Americans, as well as dietary reference intakes. So dietary reference intakes are a series of terms and values that are developed and published by the Institute for Medicine, which is now an organization called the Health and Medicine Division. The HMD, previously the IOM, is housed within the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, which is a nonprofit institution focused on research, understanding, and publishing the foremost research in various bodies of science, nutrition being one of them. So the Dietary Reference Intakes, as published by the IOM or the HMD, is a representation of the most current scientific knowledge on the nutritional needs of healthy populations. The DRIs, so Dietary Reference Intakes, I'll refer to as DRIs, were developed in order to prevent and reduce the risk of chronic disease. These were developed once we started to understand that so much chronic disease was based in nutritional deficiencies. So by setting average and recommended intakes for different nutrients, the IOM was hoping to reduce this incidence of chronic disease. At the same time, these reference intakes are designed to help promote optimal health in humans. One major caveat of the dietary reference intakes, it's not necessarily a fault or a shortcoming, it's simply definitely should be noted that these are standards for healthy people only. So these standards were not created for people with illness or disease. These are reference intakes for a healthy person to basically stay healthy and avoid chronic disease. So here is your DRIs in an absolute nutshell. The dietary reference intakes are further categorized into 6 different basically terms. So we have estimated average requirement, we have recommended daily allowance, we have adequate intake, we have upper limit, we have estimated energy requirement, and we have acceptable macronutrient distribution range. So there are a few that we see a lot more regularly. Those are going to be the recommended daily allowances, or the RDAs, and then the estimated energy requirement, or the AMDR. But here's a quick definition for what each one of these is. So the estimated average requirement is the average daily nutrient intake required to meet the nutritional needs of 50% of a population. So it's a super average estimate, as the name would imply. The RDA, which is a recommended daily allowance, is the average daily nutrient intake, so the average amount of a nutrient that should be consumed on a daily basis that would be required to meet the nutritional needs of 97 to 98% of the population. That's why I say the RDA is a much more commonly seen term, because it's developed, this reference value was developed to account for almost the entire population. So a very useful reference. The adequate intake, or the AI, is used when the RDA is not available. And then the upper limit, or sometimes you'll see it written as the tolerable upper limit, is the highest intake of a nutrient that someone can consume without posing a serious health risk to him or herself. So if you watched the basic nutrition lecture, you might remember that certain fat-soluble vitamins can be stored within our fat cells within our bodies. So then if we take in excess quantities of those vitamins, we can potentially cause a health risk to ourselves because we store the excess. So then on the right-hand side, you see DRIs for energy and for macronutrients. So what's written on the left, the DRIs for most nutrients, tends to pertain to our micronutrients, although they do also pertain to the macros. But the macronutrients also have a couple other specific reference values. That's going to be your EER and your AMDR. So the estimated energy requirement is something that can be determined pretty specifically on a person-by-person basis. So the EER is determined by age, gender, weight, height, and physical activity levels. So this is the average daily intake of a macronutrient, of protein, fat, or carbohydrate, that would be required to maintain proper energy balance for that person. So again, that's why age, weight, height, and the amount of physical activity are going to play a really big role. Then the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, or the AMDR, is a range, so from high to low, a range within a nutrient, an intake range within a nutrient, within which the person would have a reduced risk of chronic disease. The AMDR is expressed as a percentage of total intake. So you'll see the acceptable macronutrient distribution range for carbohydrate, the AMDR for protein, the AMDR for fat. So as long as a person is eating carbohydrate within the AMDR range, that person should be healthy and free of chronic disease. If the person eats too little carbohydrate or too much carbohydrate, the same would go with too much or too little fat or protein, that person sets him or herself up with a higher risk of developing a chronic disease like diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, diseases related to inflammation. So then we have the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. So this is something that is published jointly by the United States Department of Agriculture, the USDA, and the United States Department of Health and Human Services. So where the IOM is a non-governmental body, so publishing information without necessarily interacting with the government, the DGAs come specifically from our federal government. These are written every 5 years, so the current Dietary Guidelines for Americans are for 2015 to 2020. You'll see the picture on the right is the cover from the 2010 to 2015 Dietary Guidelines. So these are written to provide nutritional and dietary information and guidelines for the general public. Again, very similar to the DRIs, but the dietary guidelines tend to be more guidelines for overall how to be eating. And now, in the current version, also how to be living a healthy lifestyle. So if you're following along on Blackboard, you'll see that there are a couple of readings associated with the DGAs, and you can read the executive summary of the DGA 2015-2020. So I just pulled out a couple key pieces of information from the executive summary. Some of the highlights are that this information that the USDA and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services put together winds up being the source of information used to develop all federal nutrition education programs, all federal nutrition, food, and health policies and programs. So rarely would any sort of federal or governmental body, I mean, it happens in some cases, but a lot of times they don't look outside of this information published by the DGA. So this sets the standards for any sort of federal program relating to nutrition and food. What's great about this version is that the authors started to look at how the entire diet plays a role in overall eating patterns. So this version of the DGA is a lot more focused on eating patterns, where previous versions you might be familiar with the pyramid or my pyramid or my plate. Those are the previous renditions of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. So used to be the guidelines were basically eat from your 5 different food groups. So eat your grains, your proteins, your dairy, your fruits, your vegetables. But now, rather than saying eat from these 5 food groups, this version of the DGA is giving a lot more general guidelines for overall how to be eating and how to be living. So they also look at the relationships between eating patterns, so not just what the foods are, but how the person eats, the person's health, and their risk of chronic disease. Also noted is that all segments of society, so schools, workplaces, community centers, and individuals all have a role to play in helping create overall healthier food habits in our United States population. So this term healthy eating pattern comes through a lot in this version of the Dietary Guidelines. And this is not meant to be a rigid prescription for how to eat. Instead, a healthy eating pattern is supposed to serve as a framework or a guideline within which each person can enjoy different foods that meet his or her personal, cultural, and traditional preferences, also while staying within one's food budget. So this year, well, not this year, but this version has 5 guidelines for nutrition and healthy eating, healthy living. The first one is this concept of healthy eating pattern. So a healthy eating pattern involves eating a variety of vegetables. So a simple rule of thumb when thinking about eating a variety of vegetables is to eat from the rainbow. So eat vegetables from all colors of the rainbow. Eat whole fruits, eat grains, and particularly whole grains. Eat dairy or soy, eat proteins, eat oils. Limit your intake of saturated and trans fats. Limit your intake of added sugars and sodium. Also, meet the physical activity guidelines for Americans. Second guideline is to focus on variety, nutrient density, and amount. Third is to limit your calories from added sugar, saturated and trans fats, and to reduce sodium intake. 4 is to shift overall to healthier food and beverage choices. And 5, support healthy eating patterns for all, at the home, at the school, at the work, and at the community. So again, really looking at the sort of social level of food and nutrition. And then I'll just close quickly with some of the terms from the DGA summary. An eating pattern is, they're defining it as the combination of foods and beverages that constitute an individual's complete dietary intake over time. So, basically you can pull out patterns from how people eat over the course of a week. Nutrient density is a really important one, and we'll come back to this in future lectures, but nutrient density refers to foods that provide vitamins, minerals, and other substances that contribute to adequate nutrient intakes, or that may have other positive health effects with little or no solid fats, added sugars, refined starches, and sodium. Again, we're going to come back to this term, but this is a really important one, and it's really, I think it's great that in this rendition of the DGAs, they're encouraging people to focus on eating nutrient-dense foods. This is basically saying you take in a food that has a lot of great vitamins and minerals and not a lot of the lesser good stuff like the sugars, the fats, and the starches, refined starches. So examples would be, like the extreme example would be something like kale is actually one of the most nutrient dense foods compared to something like a hamburger bun from Wendy's. That's gonna be loaded with added sugar. It's gonna be made with solid fat for sure, and refined starches. So we'll come to these terms shortly in other lectures. Nutrient dense food also contains naturally occurring components such as dietary fiber. So again, something like the hamburger bun at Wendy's most likely had all the fiber removed in the process of making it, whereas kale is loaded with fiber. And then variety, not just within your veggies, but variety across all of your food groups and the subgroups. So this is really key because there really is no one food that provides you with all of the nutrients that you need. We really have to eat a variety of different foods in order to provide our bodies with all the different vitamins, all the different minerals, and a good balance of fat, protein, and carbohydrate. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.